Here I'll be explaining how I made my crankcases for my 500cc two-stroke triple engine out of two Yamaha RD350 engines. So I began with a 1975 RD350, which had been sitting in a shed for close to 30 years, which meant that everything on it was completely seized or stuck, including the pistons to the cylinders. In order to get the pistons free, I made a tool out of steel plate to try and push and rotate the crankshaft, which ended up making a hole in the piston, but it worked out in the end. Other than that, though, the engine seemed in pretty decent shape, as it only had about 12,000 miles on it from when it was last parked. I then repeat this process with another engine I found off eBay, which was in very similar condition to the one I found off of the bike. To add on another cylinder, I would be cutting the left cylinder in half from the base engine and adding on another 1.5 cylinders from the donor engine. I began by cutting the top crankcase in half, giving myself about 1/4 inch of extra room that would be milled down later to the exact dimension. I repeat the same thing with the lower half crankcase, which took much longer due to the thickness of it, but eventually I got there. I now had to cut the more difficult part of the crankcase, which was the small part that would be getting welded onto the main part of the engine. After about a couple hours of sawing, I had the roughed out crankcases ready to be milled down into their final shape. I first start by clamping the two crankcase halves together and then milling them down to the exact halfway point of where the crankshaft will be sitting, so they could be welded together later on. I then try my best to line up the backside of the crankcase with a dial indicator so it can be milled down flat there as well. I then mill down the other mating surface where the crankshaft will be going to exactly the halfway point again. I then had to do the difficult part, which was mill down the backside mating surface where the other case would meet and be welded to. If I messed up, the whole part would be scrap because there would be too big of a gap allowing for movement. I mill this part down until one certain area of the crankcase is paper thin, which tells me that I'm exactly where I need to be, so I stop there. I also turned down a solid steel bar that matched the crankshaft bearings in order to align the cases when being welded together. I do a test fit, and I was very happy with what I saw. I got the crankcase opening within a few thousandths of an inch. Since this engine doesn't have a middle cylinder originally, I have to create one, and I do this by cutting the fins off of an original cylinder so it can fit in the middle of the crankcases. I then repeat the same thing with the cylinder head, and I'm very careful here to not cut into the mating surface where the head gasket seals. I do a test fit, and everything fits together very nicely, so I send all the parts off to vapor blasting so I can weld them together. I get the crankcases back, which look amazing. Now they're almost ready for welding. All I have to do now is put in a few bevels in so I could get a nice strong weld on the two halves. I then bolt the two halves together, which fit nice and tight together, which is exactly what I'm after, because this is where I do not want any distortion to happen. I didn't have anything to preheat the crankcases, which was not optimal, but after running a few tack welds on the outside, the crankcases began to heat up, which worked out okay, I guess. After letting the crankcases cool down evenly overnight, I separate them, and here you can see the bevels that I put in with a file before the crankcases were welded together. After the welding is complete, I take a carbide burr on a drill and start contouring all the surfaces that I welded. The gasket surfaces are filed down most of the way and then sanded down with fine sandpaper so that there's a nice smooth finish that matches the rest of the gasket surface. Thanks for watching. In the next episode, I'll be explaining how I made the crankshaft and a few other bits and pieces.